A little on a short time, so I assume you can record. Anyway, she's the professor and also a chair of the Department of History and Political Science at the Missouri University of Science and Technology. Her book, The Politics of Everyday Life in Vichy, France, Foreigners, Undesirables, and Strangers, is 2009, an excellent study of the Limoges. And then a book about to come out in 2017, Stealing Home, Looting, Restitution, and Reconstruction, and Jewish Lives in France, 1942 to 47.
Well, thank you, first of all, to all of our panelists. I'm going to just make some observations, and I'll leave the questions to our audience, because similar themes in other panels that we've seen already today, I think, are reflected here. All three of our papers take different approaches to the question of accommodation during the Vichy years. Sandy Ott explores the actions and treatment of a pro-Vichy mayor and his family in the Basque region through a post-war trial dossier. Using archival evidence and anthropological fieldwork, Sandy shows the complexity of trying to categorize individuals' decisions and relationships during the war. The Doyenards seem to have used their, quote, relations with the Germans to aid the citizens of Guattari, and Sandy characterizes their actions as Franco-German accommodation that was at once structural, deliberate, and opportunistic. But when brought before the post-war justice system, community members defended the family, putting aside political and ideological differences. Brett Bowles also uses a case study to examine accommodation, this time approaching the topic from the field of film studies. His investigation of Marcel Pagnol's wartime activities centers upon the accommodations the filmmaker made with both Vichy and the Germans in order to aid himself. Brett concludes that Pagnol initially began working for Vichy for professional and economic survival, but this soon gave way to opportunism. With the commercial success of La Fille de Puisatier, this accommodation was no longer necessary, and it was then that Pagnol cut ties with Vichy and the Nazis. Despite his post-war assertions that he did not collaborate, Pagnol's films and the archival records show otherwise. Finally, Audra Murfeld-Langston approaches the same questions regarding French wartime actions from a literary perspective through Marcel Aimé's collection of stories in the Vin de Paris. Audra demonstrates that the short stories serve as a site of contested memory, where Aimé sought to reveal the hypocrisy, corruption, and decidedly unheroic actions of the French during the war. While the other two papers feature at least some interaction with the Germans, Aimé's accommodation takes place within the context of the German occupation, but the Germans are marginal. Instead, Aimé examines French relationships on a daily basis and the ways that individuals were looking for opportunities to take advantage of their fellow citizens. One of the things that I found most interesting in all of the papers is how they point to a pattern that appears to repeat both during and after the war. We see how strategies for wartime survival transformed into opportunism and then are further transformed into exploiting the wartime situation for personal profit. That profit may have differed: political, financial, material, or for the benefit of others, but there was always an advantage to the accommodation. We see these same patterns in the post-war period as well, even though we don't call it accommodation. So drawing from our papers today, Doyenard and Pagnol are trying to navigate and survive the post-war purge, and they take advantage of the opportunity of the myth of resistance to try and exploit it to their advantage. So less punishment or having their cases dropped. So again, we have a survival, opportunism, exploitation pattern. While Aimé does not seem to be using the same process for his personal gain, although he may have been in order to keep publishing throughout this whole period, and Audra said he's publishing in the journals for money, for his family, we see him pointing out this transformation process in French society through his fictional characters. Small accommodations become larger transgressions. What I might suggest is that our imposition of a historiographical framework or interpretation of the war in post-war years, and in this case that framework is accommodation, transforms the way we talk about the past. And yes, I know this is a really obvious statement, but I was thinking about the individuals who are involved in all three papers And they were not thinking about naming their actions or figuring out where they fell on the resistance to collaboration spectrum during the war, more so after, right, to figure out how to help themselves. All three were interested in daily lives, either their own or portraying them to larger audiences, or both. Their strategies were similar, whether it was during or after the war, when our interpretive framework of accommodation no longer fits. They were interested in questions of morality and justice, concepts that were very fluid during the time period, and they change from the war to the post-war period. So how do we define morality and justice? And I think everybody uses this term of necessary accommodation. How do we define that? Who decides? All three papers also point to the fact that it is very difficult for scholars to uncover how much support the Vichy government had or how influential their policies were, since people were actively manipulating the policies for their own ends. All three papers also highlight how individuals sought to actively write their own histories in the post-war period. Individuals demonstrated their agency against the state in both the context of the Vichy regime and the restored republic, and either accepted or challenged the dominant narrative. Both the Doyenarts and Pagnol drew on de Gaulle's idea of France as a nation of resistors, while Aimé challenged the resistentialist myth. And I'm just going to leave things there so we have time to hear audience questions. And thank you again to all three panelists for interesting case studies from very different perspectives that all shed light on the daily decisions that people made.
All right, well, this has been a really great panel, so let's just open it up for discussion, questions, comments. I had a quick, he also wrote The Life Ration, didn't he?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, if you haven't read that, it's about they ration days, and depending on your usefulness to the economy, you get so many days, and then of course there's a black market, and people are living 600 days in a month, and it's typical. Anyway, so I was just thinking that was him. Any other questions?
There's a film, I don't know if I want to go into that. There's a film with Justin Timberlake in it that has people kind of, their lives are rationed to the time, and like when you're 18, your clock starts and you only get a certain amount of time, but you can buy time from other people, and I think that's, loosely based off the MA story. I want to ask the question I asked this morning, which is, but I don't remember what the film is called. I want to ask the question I asked this morning, which is that, like, is this notion of accommodation and like accommodating one's own moral code to what's going on around, like, we talk about it constantly in the context of the occupation and of Vichy and in this moment, but is it different? Like, can we ask this question in the contemporary period and thinking about, kind of moral frameworks and, economic necessity and the compromises and the necessary accommodation that humans make to live in society? And I wonder why we're so drawn to these questions in this period and not necessarily in others, and if you all have thoughts about this.
That's a good question.
As a question, idea.
Anybody? Well, I'll jump in and then you guys see what you think. I think it's about trying to move away from the dichotomy of resistance or collaboration. And so if everything has to go into that black and white category, then a lot of this stuff is just plain collaboration. But when you come along and say, well, it's not really that simple, then you blur the lines, and then you have this sort of, ever-expanding space for things that may or may not be very good to be doing.
But I think that's what was really interesting in these papers, is because now they're expanding it beyond just the war, right? And these are all about post-war, and then how you play with those things as well. So we did start with it in the war period, and now it's now it's drawing out. It's going out into the purge and post-war justice, and then I think it is a good question. Can you take it even further? And then but then you get to the question of then how useful are the terms and the categories, and
And I guess I'd add, too, that there's the interest of trying to take the post-war perspective as people tell, because they're talking in post-war times, looking back, and the language they use to describe their choices and actions. Who knows if they'd been interrogated during the occupation about their behaviors in private and not in front of the court, how they would have described it. But I think that I'm also interested in Gildy's notion of cohabitation as a different perspective on, less in terms of collaboration, but more in terms of accommodating in the sense of just getting by. But in that, I think one of the things also is I'm trying to get away from in interpreting people's statements is that even the notion of accommodation, sometimes Burin makes it seem quite fixed. He says it's either structural, deliberate, or non-deliberate, and there's all kinds of gray area in between in terms of how people behave, which I think comes out in this curious case of the Doyen Arts.
I know that you had a question, Leo?
I have a comment because the papers reminded me that the last year of Un Village Français is about to be screened. It might already have started, and how all these issues of collaboration, accommodation, whatever, are so subtly portrayed. I mean, there is an historian behind all this, but I am teaching a seminar in Vichy, France, and somehow I wish I could just sit them down and go, oh, five years have English subtitles now. This is what you need to know. But that's just a side comment. I had a question about Continental. Is the word out now? Is that the consensus that it was, I don't know, collaborationist or German-controlled? I guess I'm going by, was it Chabrol? One of these guys did a film on it, right?
Don't believe anything Chabrol says about the occupation, and don't watch L'Œil de Vichy.
L'Œil de Vichy, never mind. But there is one about two of the filmmakers from Continental, who are portrayed quite positively, not as German stooges, etc. And I was just wondering whether this was a legitimate approach, or this has just been totally
I guess that's a question for me. Alfred Graven is a very interesting historical figure. I'll just start with that. And he's someone that all scholars of French cinema during the occupation mention, but nobody really knows anything about. And I'm working with a Belgian scholar who obviously reads Dutch. He's from the Flemish part of Belgium, but he also reads German very, very well, which I don't. And he's found amazing archives related to Graven and Continental in the Bundesarchiv. And so we're working on a very long chapter about Graven and how he was really an exception within the Nazi administrative hierarchy in the field of cultural policy. And Continental was really exceptional. I mean, it's 100% German capital. It's Ufa, it's Toba's capital. But Graven had a huge, huge margin of freedom. And he often got into very nasty arguments with Otto Abetz, with a certain Dr. Dietrich, who was the head of the Referat film of the Propaganda Abteilung in Paris. And he was essentially given complete freedom by Goebbels to do what he wanted with the film markets in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. I don't think there's been yet a proper assessment of Graven among historians. Graven it's very clear, I don't want to go on too long, but he was not an ideologue. In fact, he was briefly excommunicated from the Nazi Party for getting drunk and making negative remarks about Hitler in 1935. Graven was greedy. He wanted as much money, as much power as a film producer as he could amass. And he loved going to parties like the picture I showed. He loved, having illicit affairs with movie stars. He loved being, a high-rolling producer. And he wasn't interested in ideology. And Goebbels tried to get him toward the end of the occupation to make some French language ideological pictures, and Graven refused. And he said that because they're junk, the French won't go see them, and then we can't export them somewhere else. This is about making money. It's about economic colonization, and that's what Graven was all about. And on the flip side, he gave a lot of opportunities to French directors who had, for one reason or another, never previously gotten an opportunity in the profession. I mean, you think about, Clouzot is the best example. Chavance and Clouzot, and and he employed Jean-Paul de Chanois as a writer, for God's sake. I mean, this is a guy, he's affiliated with the Popular Front, he's a Jew, Graven didn't care. He was a good writer, and he was willing to work for Continental, so Graven signed him up, That was really his attitude.
So the quid pro quo that you had mentioned,
the exchange agreements, yeah.
Film showing the occupied zone and then about 2 Continental films.
Oh, there were more than 2. There are a number of, it's sort of a sliding scale of exchange agreements across the demarcation line, and then of course that politics collapses after November 1942 when the Germans invade the South, and there's not a lot Vichy can do about it anymore. I mean, local priests can complain, but then they don't really have any censorship, purview over what the Germans are sending down from Paris.
But it's not pro-German. I mean, there's no pro-German line that was filmed, right?
Oh, no, not at all. No, not at all. No, entertainment.
So I have a question kind of for all three of you, and it's really coming out of Sandy's paper, because what seems to be going on here is that there's a continuity of kind of action and behavior, and then the kind of situation of the invasion, occupation, and then the situation of liberation are all changing parameters around continuity of action. So in a sense, does this tell us that even something like accommodation is not really, kind of like Sarah's saying, not even really a sound way of thinking about these kind of contingent moments where there has to be interaction, where otherwise behaviors seem to have, I was thinking about what Brett said too, like there's this kind of continuity of attitude almost, and the occupation is a nuisance for some, or just something to get through. So could you kind of talk about that for a bit?
Maybe I'll start with the ethnographic part here. I think that I think these questions about the value of the term accommodation are certainly important, and I appreciate that. And what struck me about this dossier is what you've just capsulized, that the changing accents and attitude are very chameleon-like, and we know we've had other examples of that in the literature from trial dossiers. But here people are, they must have known, those Duyart women must have known that that they were being frowned upon for openly, publicly flaunting their relationship with the Germans. And likewise, Pierre Duyart was taking a huge risk, and I can't imagine he didn't know that it was very risky eating at the same restaurant every day, spending tons and tons of money, enjoying yourself too in wartime. So they took, where did they place risk in this? And then trying to capitalize on skills like having learned German. I'm not sure where they learned. Did they learn it with the occupiers? I don't know. Or if they'd taken German somewhere else. But then flipping it over and saying, instead of this is being something bad, now we're putting it to good use. So I think that's what you're trying to get at. We're always searching for different terms, because collaboration, resistance, we long knew were difficult categories. And what you're saying is accommodation seems to be as well. And I just want to say one other thing in relation to this particular dossier. I've seen other examples of Basque communities and Béarnais communities that tore themselves apart when women behaved like that. And I can't answer it with this dossier because it's too thin, but sometimes small face-to-face Basque communities ended up regarding themselves as their own moral community and wanted to deal with justice themselves rather than let the external authorities do that. And I'm not sure that there's some dynamic going on there in relation to that. I think there's something cultural that I can't quite get at because I don't have enough testimonies, but in trying to answer why did people in the Liberation Committee, the local people, protect him, and why didn't they go after these women? I think it's something other than just a moral code about men and male behavior toward women, but perhaps this notion of small face-to-face communities saying we're not going to take action, therefore nobody else should.
Well, I thought it was really, because it's the shield theory, right? He shielded them, and why does it work for this community and it doesn't work? Well, and it doesn't work for Pétain, right? That was his argument that he was. He
didn't actually shield anybody.
Well, right.
Yeah. I mean, if there's a Jewish family that survived,
it actually did kind of work, though.
Well,
I mean, if you think about like Simon Kitzen's book and how Vichy pursued German spies in the unoccupied zone, if you look at propaganda, all the Vichy, especially the nonfiction film they're producing up until really mid-42, is really all about this kind of people who want to believe, it's giving them a basis for believing that Vichy, as they're rebuilding the Armistice Army, we've got the National Revolution, it's a new kind of social cohesion, the Charte du Travail, and all this stuff, and that it lets people believe who want to that, oh, well, why are we strengthening ourselves? Not to just collaborate with the Germans, right? We're going to re-enter the war in some circumstance in the future. And a lot of Vichy propaganda pushes that way.
Right, but I mean, under the surface of that propaganda, you have what she's describing.
No, absolutely.
And everybody knows
so it's a cinematic myth that some people buy into and some people don't.
Right, and it gets more and more, distant from reality as time goes on.
Yeah, absolutely, and it falls apart once Laval comes and takes power. I mean, it falls apart. But I just wanted to say, in response to John, I was really taken with Burin when I first read his work and this idea of accommodation and sliding scale and a gray zone. I actually don't like it anymore, which is part of the reason I changed my title. And the more I work on this stuff, and the more I think about it, especially Pagnol, I think about using Bourdieu and this notion of champ in sociological terms, and how each person and each person within a community is a differently configured champ, right? And those parameters are different for each person in each community, and they're also constantly shifting as material circumstances, political circumstances, military circumstances are changing. And I think it makes it very difficult to use any fixed set of criteria to describe or talk about it in the first instance, but then especially to judge. And thinking about Pagnol, I feel like I know Marcel. I mean, I've been working on him for so long. And I mean, if he had said before the Purge Committee what I said today, it wouldn't have even been comprehensible for them. And so if you think about it, it sort of makes sense for him to defend himself and narrate his experience the way he did, because he honestly didn't feel he had anything to hide, and he shouldn't have been punished for anything. He did what he had to do to survive, and then when it became apparent that he would have to work directly for a German, he said, no, thank you. And by that time, he was financially stable enough to make that choice without dire consequence. So, yeah, he lied about a lot of stuff, but if he had told Vichy no about Marcel Kébir and La France En Marche, they could well have just said, well, guess what, buddy? Get out, we're taking your studios, And I think at a certain point we also have to recognize the right of people to sort of narrate their lives, right, and make sense of their own lives in a circumstance when they know, and again this is MA, the administrative culture is so blind and vindictive and frankly stupid and hypocritical and itself kind of immoral.
Right.
And I think that, when I first discovered all this about Pagnol, I thought, oh, that scumbag, and, he lied about this, he lied about that, he rented his studios, the Continental, and all this stuff. And then the more I thought about it, the more I thought, it actually kind of makes sense to me. Because he couldn't tell the truth in front of a Purge Committee, the whole truth, and they didn't have enough distance to judge it the way we judge it today. So I actually now have come full circle, and I kind of defend his right to narrate his occupation the way that he did. And I don't think that he was being especially hypocritical by letting other people who were accused of things by their colleagues off as the head of the SACD. So.
Well, we're actually 5 minutes, almost 10 minutes past time. Thank you all for coming. The last session of the last day.